let me just summarize the discussion a little bit, to take it from here. So we got a bit of an insight into the difference between higher education, vocational education, more training graduates to be job ready. You can almost think of themselves as sort of blue collar digital workers, whereas, the higher education part is more aimed at, self-directed learning, and each operates under their own distinct frameworks. We've learned, for example, that vocational education operates with training packages, which you don't necessarily have to come up with. But if you were to use a training package, there is then also the aspect of that being renewed on average about every 5 years or so, which can pose a challenge for a very fast moving industry. So that already, establishes, I guess, some baselines and gives some insight into the various mechanics of games-related education in Australia. Now, Justin, highlighted, some of the things that are very much, associated with higher education. Reference group, for example, that is indeed a requirement under the higher education standard framework, which is in turn something that very much dictates higher education in Australia. Justin, could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit further, and how that contrasts to something like a training package?
Yeah, so in higher education, it works slightly different. Training packages are driven from the industry to start with as a group, which come with a guiding. And I think, like Neil said, you've got some scope to contextualize and to modify, to make some changes, to keep it up to date, provided you can justify those changes and they're relevant. But in the university sector, with self-accrediting universities, it's more around curriculum guiding principles. So when you develop or design curriculum, they're done in-house and then approved via academic boards, etc. We have guiding principles that are more broadly about developing people. So things like, having sustainability as a focus, being ethical, being engaged and empowered as a learner, being critical and creative thinkers is a huge one. And so there's sort of our underlying guiding principles that help inform our curriculum design. And then, of course, we also have other embedded perspectives that we'd like to focus on. So we have Indigenous, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander cultural perspectives that we also focus on here. But also, I guess it's not only about fulfilling a need in industry, but it's about developing the learner to a higher level. I think that when we look at the framework that Neil showed with the different AQF levels, I think that's really the driving mechanism. So once you go past 5, 6, 7, it starts becoming more about being a autonomous worker, being able to make decisions on your own and reflect on your work, improve on your work. So it's kind of, while we are increasingly heading towards fulfilling the needs of industry and being engaged with industry, and that's always been a valid and a valuable exercise, I think, across both sectors. I feel like universities that I've been involved with are heading towards that way a bit more, and the government agenda is to do that a little bit more. But also we still have that focus of developing some of those higher thinkings and higher order sort of knowledge skills around those perspectives. So yeah, it's kind of a different focus.
Sort of interesting when you hear universities saying, we actually do this thing called, we talk to industry now. And so people know that like what we're teaching actually is what they do in it. Yeah. And of course, it actually relates to skills you might use outside, and
yeah, having a vocational background,
getting jobs and things, and which is a big change the last 10 years, I think. To make, a lot of the universities have said we actually need to prove that we're actually making a difference and be competitive against.
I think there's other sectors of graduate attributes that really can be valuable in higher education, like focusing on entrepreneurship. Being able to do, a lot of my graduates shift from wanting to be employed into wanting to have their own startup. And they get a little bit more time to bake in that area and really start to sort of look at things like entrepreneurship, marketing and other sectors, so they can go across a broad depth of, not only depth of knowledge in the discipline, but breadth of knowledge across different disciplines as well at university. So I think when I put my sort of vocational hat on, I love that it's so engaged with industry. It's driven by industry. And I really like that myself. I mean, that's what I stayed in it for so long for. But when I put my university hat on, I can also see those skills like entrepreneurship and personal development and how to establish and create professional networks are really valuable skills for lots of different areas of games as well. So the industry as a whole can benefit, I think, from engaging at both levels.
Yeah,
and I think we can both benefit in both sectors as well by engaging with each other as well. So.
And in fact, I think the best graduates that I'll often see are students. We've had some fantastic graduates that have gone through the university sector, and they felt that they're really well-rounded learners, but they still don't have the level of practical skill that's going to get them work in the industry, whether that's programming or those hands-on art skills. And we've had students that have gone on to do their degree, because when they finish their advanced diploma at AIE or the graduate diploma, they weren't in a rush to get to industry, or they just wanted to keep learning, or all sorts of different reasons. But they've gone on and done their degree, and certainly you can really see them extend and really explore different areas and do some really interesting things that they wouldn't have otherwise done if they'd gone straight into the workforce. So, and an employer's then been able to see what that person's done, and based on that combination of really practical hands-on skills, but then really being able to explore some really interesting experiential and experimental areas.
Yeah, I think there's two main sort of areas that I found a lot of success in with graduates and employability, and the ones that are successful employment, engaging with industry or getting jobs, were two models. And the first one was to introduce an on-campus game studio. So it was Studio Kaboom at TAFE Queensland. And then the other one was to have a international study tour. So the studio model allowed them to work and actually be in a practical environment every day. And the international study tour really helped them to learn how to network professionally, learn how to identify opportunities and take those opportunities, and to develop confidence to actually be able to do that. And so I think when you do get those graduates come back from university, you're kind of getting into a vocational environment, probably getting that success because they are a bit more confident, they know how to network, they've been out doing things. I'm just going from the perspective of the majority of people we see, and that is school leavers. Obviously you get mature age, which have those skills already, and we see a lot of success with mature age as well. I don't know, is that how you feel in vocational as well, Neil? Or?
The mature age learners?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's we get a real combination of people. I think we used to get a lot more mature age students through the vocational pathway. I think you're probably less so now. It tends to be typically more school leavers coming through. So and I think universities probably see more of the mature age learners because we are getting quite an educated population. So so people have done something, and so they're looking to extend themselves into that masters and beyond area. And there's quite a lot of support for that. It's only going back 5-10 years that you didn't see a lot of post-grad options for games.
Yeah.
Now there's lots of options.
There's lots, yes.
And I think that's where that is where I would love to see more, but that is where a lot of, I think, mature age learners are looking. But it's interesting, looking at some of the masters in animation programs that, again, they're looking at getting students to explore and apply the skills in various areas, but the animation skills they come out with don't necessarily compare with a student in our Year 1 course. So it is, it is. We'll have teachers apply for positions at AIE and have their masters in animation.
Just going back to that sort of thing brought up with having apprentices, we developed the on-campus game studio because we couldn't get undergraduates into game studios. That was a challenge. NDAs, etc., created a real problem with us trying to get us engaged with them. So we set up that. Do you have work experience models or anything like that in vocational?
Yeah, I mean, we try and work with studios that have got, because industry's got projects that don't run to academic timetables.
Yeah.
We're really trying to give students meaningful participation. Yeah. There's some great studios that we work with regularly for some more of our QA units and testing. But for things like real experience on real projects, we're really trying to be flexible and fit in. And so the student's going to have that experience. It's going to be, they're not in there making, as much as useful as it is to come into a studio and see what they're doing, unless there's value for the studio. And
I think that's one of the distinctions we have, and that's a difference between work experience and work integrated learning.
Yeah.
Getting work experience is handy and nice. Thanks, Studio A, for letting them come and make you coffee. But what we really value is work integrated learning, and that's where they're actually picking up some skills and knowledge along the way. And it's one of the reasons actually, we were teaching Scrum and Sprint and all the agile methodologies, and until they're actually in a production environment working to that methodology, they wouldn't really absorb it very well. So it's one of the reasons we went down that path. So the challenge for us is always connecting with industry, is having genuine, authentic work integrated learning experiences. The people that we have worked with in the past, and this is going back quite a while, most of those people who are in those scenarios with studios would pick up at the end. So we didn't have a lot of failures in that system, but the challenge was getting that system established with the industry. So I think that's something that would be great to collaborate more with industry on and get more support with.
Yeah, I think if you don't have the realistic experience, the opportunities for the student showing how great they are and how well they're going to fit into that team environment and the value that they present is they just don't have that opportunity to show it. So if it's just a run of the mill, we're going to take another graduate on. They just don't. It's not as valuable for the studio or for the students. So
a bit of a long
if I may, so just listening to your conversation, it seems to me that the lines between higher education and VET are becoming increasingly blurry. You know, Justin, you talk about some things that aligns higher education students with more of a VET outlook. Neil, I'm sure there is some higher education sensibilities built into your curriculum as well in terms of giving students direction to explore something. So is it a matter then that we sort of coming from both sides and slowly starting to meet in the middle, where there is a recognition that we need to have these technical skills, but then also students have this ability to work in a self-directed manner and independently, also a crucial skill within within the studio and in the workplace.
Yeah, and I think somewhere in the middle, industry meets us somewhere. We have to have some sort of engagement there to keep those things happening in meaningful ways.
And then going on from what you were saying in terms of the engagement with the industry. So, it also sounds like there is a responsibility and part of the industry to keep this conversation going and have a continuous conversation with the likes of you.
Yeah, I think going through the boom of the 2000s, early 2000s in Brisbane particularly, and we could find graduates positions easily and everyone was engaged, and industry was really keen to connect and to offer opportunities for our graduates, and then to come out the other side and just have it fall off, and then watching it slowly build again now, which is really encouraging. I'd like to see more of a sustained approach long term, and I think like IGA and industry bodies such as that are great vehicles to maintain consistency between the collaboration between industry, and things like this are great. But help us to maintain some consistency there, so that when we're going through these long cycles, Neil's case might be a 5 to 7 year cycle. In our curriculum, we can change a little bit, a bit more agile, but we have a lot of other forces at play when we try to change things. So cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches, limited courses, things like that.
Yeah. Can you maybe go into those forces a bit more deeply? Because again, I guess this is a good example for some of the things that are just invisible to some of the industry who might think, why don't they do that? Well, because it might be a bit harder than you think.
Well, yeah. So it's not always a situation where we can just say, okay, let's start a games course and we get unlimited courses, because unlimited. So there's financial constraints is one thing, but there's also a responsibility to actually allow students to explore and to grow. And I mentioned breadth before. The concept of having breadth in a curriculum is a good idea. Allowing students to take up electives and become more rounded and maybe go cross and interdisciplinary in their activity is also quite valuable for growing and developing. Some of the students might come into games, for example, and then transition into design or other fields of design, or maybe they'll go into something totally different. And likewise, we have students find games through that process as well. So I think we're balancing sort of the value that is interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary programs where they come into a broad design field and study a major in games, for example. And we're also balancing being specific and having the depth in a particular field to actually get them employed. So that's a real challenge in university curriculum design. There's some great strategies around it. Work integrated learning is one. But yeah, we try and meet that as best we can.
Yeah, and I guess then there is the engagement with the likes of the academic board to ensure that it's all signed off.
Of course, and you know, there's always I mean, I'll always be an advocate for the games programs, employability, and where the games industry as a whole. But in like any workplace, maybe not everyone is, you know. So you've also got to be a voice, and most organisations, every organisation I've ever been in, requires people to be a voice for that particular discipline, and to actually try and establish the requirements and show that the importance and significance of it. Games in particular, because of its rapid growth as a whole. I mean, it's you know, 40-year industry really, and it's now one of the biggest. And that's, when you look at the timeline of academia, that's kind of very short and very fast. So there's a lot of catch up going on, and most universities, like one I work for, has really grabbed onto it and embracing it wholly. Also, the previous ones I've worked for before. So that's really refreshing. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's everywhere. I don't think that's, you know, games sparks excitement everywhere like it does in some places. But as an industry, I think as the industry matures and academia is maturing along with it, we'll see better synergy between industry and academia.
Yeah. Well, there you go. 40 years, young and agile in the eyes of academia.
Yeah, and I think something to point out is some of the universities, and I can't speak for yours, but it's certainly, I've worked with a couple, and just getting the curriculum through is an epic long-term project, which can take anywhere between 2 to 3 years, and by the time consoles platforms come and go and technologies become redundant, I guess one of the things that the training packages, I guess one of the nice things is that they are so flexible that, you know, you can, the nice thing about our training package courses is that we update about 30% of the content every year. So because it isn't prescriptive about what you need to use, that we can.
One of the strategies I do for that is the work integrated learning components, where we actually do, like we have on campus game studio, for example. We do that here as well, where we develop courses, just like you said. Well, a training package doesn't prescribe exactly what to do. It gives you broad terms, and then you contextualize with those. So we stay on, if it says you must create an industry standard 3D model, we do similar sort of stuff like that as well with our work integrated learning, where we can actually connect with industry, and we can do things that are contemporary and relevant, and sort of maintain
to make up for the shortfalls in the rest of the curriculum.
Yeah. Well, what we could do is maintain currency, really, is the difficult thing. So if you're looking at a 3-year turnaround to get a program, and, you know, a dev kit's old by the time you get one in, and you actually start working on it, the new console's coming out. So the consistency comes through those kind of, you know, programs that are specific around it. So,
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the big thing. I think the longer too, the training, so that we know that a student that starts is going to be out in 2 years. You guys have got 3, and I think there's universities that are doing 4-year training. And so the course the students start, you know, the course has been developed 3 years, potentially 2 to 3 years before that, and they commence that. And then the world that they merge into, which potentially 6 years later, isn't the one that
that's right,
the course is written for. So that's the nice thing, I think, of having some of that flexibility, and that. Yeah.
Well, I often refer to that concept of the jobs you're trying to get are the ones that don't exist yet.
Exactly. And I think
and if it's the honours and beyond, I'm telling them you're making the new jobs. So, you know.
I think it does come down to what I have probably found, is that the difference is the institutions. And I think, you know, the institutions that have that growth mindset have the relatively nimble and can adapt and are responsive to what industry is doing, I think is really what students should be looking out for. I think sometimes people get stuck on it being a degree, or they get stuck on it being a particular level, and maybe what they don't look at is what the graduates are doing, what sort of cool projects they're working on, because they're trusting that the institution is doing all the right things. But there's certainly, I have seen a really wide array of, we see, because I see a lot of students applying with us, and you would see that as well.
Yep.
And just the ability of the students come in with that is obviously reflective, and I'm sure the industry sees this as well. They get to know the institutions that are teaching the right stuff.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to like the institutions are the people in the institution. So, you know, anywhere I've worked, I've been really, really fortunate to be working with people who are really motivated to get into games and motivated to make connections and to make games and to make things happen. So I think that I've been fortunate in that, but I know that's not always the way when you're sitting in a team at a large organization that everyone's in the same sort of agenda and wants to achieve the same things. And I think that when you are in those situations where you've got a team that are really focused and really want to play ball with the games sector, then we see really cool things happen. But it does take a team in an institution or organization to have that sort of clarity of vision and really know how valuable it is and to focus towards it. Otherwise, it could be quite challenging to get things done.
One more thing that I would like to explore a bit further, because we're slowly coming to the end of our conversation. So we now have a good understanding of what VET does. We have an understanding of what higher education does. We realize that we're slowly, meeting in the middle in terms of, institutions like TAFE, for example, starting to offering degrees. So, that's just one example. And, we've learned about some of the constraints. Neil rightfully pointed out that the creation of curriculum can take years. Even if you're self-accrediting, there's still certain Q&A mechanisms that you're going to meet. You're going to run it past the academic board and so on. But, another factor in terms of how these outcomes and expectations are set is funding. Funding, through the government, for example, for the various sectors and, where that money is actually going. Neil, as someone who works in VET, which, has suffered a little bit lately, what's your take on that? How do these funding streams, regulate those outcomes?
Yeah, so I guess, vocational side, the government, provides money for vocational education, primarily through the TAFE system. So they support the TAFE system, and that money goes to the state governments, and they put that into practice in the way that they see fit. Generally speaking, they're looking at the needs of industry and what areas are hard to fill, and so they fund those things accordingly. So I think during COVID, they've pushed money particularly into areas, things like, nursing and areas that they're going to see future skill gaps or not enough trained staff in that area. Trades is obviously another big one. And then there's also for private educators, well, AI is a non-profit educator, but we fall into that same group. So the funding that we don't get any funding, but we are able to access the loan system so that students can borrow just in the same way that they can for university HECS or fee help. It's called VET student loans. And so the government's got a system whereby a particular qualification is eligible for a particular sum of money. So they have different bands, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 for each band. And then they've got different qualifications that will go towards each band, and to be eligible for that, you have to demonstrate that you have close industry ties, that your students are getting employed, that you've got that industry advisory group that you are closely working with, and that you're delivering high quality education. So
that's still VET fee help now. The funding
that's called VET student loans.
VET student loans. So I think from memory, the distinction with that, though, compared to, so we have Commonwealth supported places, so HECS, it's a deferred loan system, same sort of process as VET fee help or VET student loans. But I think the biggest distinction was the amount of Commonwealth support to a VET fee student or a TAFE student versus a higher education student. So, for example, if you were to run a 3-year program under your current loans model, it might be a $50,000, $60,000 degree or something. Just based on the lack of support in that area, whereas higher education gets a little bit more support. But of course, we have other agendas attached to that money as well. So we have research expectations. We have, and bringing our research back into our classrooms and generating of new knowledge. So I think that when we look at just the training aspect, there's definitely a fee disadvantage in the vocational sector. But there is an advantage that we can focus on the job. So if that's what the goal is. But when we look at the fee structure in higher education, there is an advantage for the student, but there are some expectations around the organisation that go far beyond, such as the teaching research nexus and how that operates.
Look, we've pretty much come to the end of this conversation, but I think there are some really, really good points raised. So we now have a better understanding where higher education sits versus vocational education, the various forces that dictate how education actually works. We've heard about training packages and how flexible they can be or inflexible, the cycle of renewal in that respect, some of the guidelines that steer higher education, what needs to be considered when designing curriculum, the time frames there, the processes involved. But then there's also such things as funding for the actual courses, but also how students can access support. So, it just goes to show the various forces that affect how education is run in this country. And, again, I wanted people to have a bit of an appreciation for that. So, Justin, Neil, thank you very much for making yourself available. And I'm looking forward to some audience questions now. So thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thanks, Jens. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.